The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. My name is Mike Moscato with Blanchard System. This is the monthly Dalim tips and tricks. This usually is on the third Wednesday of the month, but we had some internal communications issues last week, so we're a week later. But of course, since it's a week later, you get 1 week's more worth of bonus material. So, you come out ahead. The topic this week, we're going to go over really tools and twists that are not new. They don't have any new features added to them, but they can sometimes be confusing and a bit opaque in terms of how they work. We're going to look at the Great Pages tool, the MergeXP tool, the decorate tool, and look at how to chop up, crop pages, manipulate your trim box, make sure it doesn't get lost, how to get it back if it does get lost. In fact, you got most people out here know this business about the zooming up to get the thing to show on your page. I won't waste your time on that. But these are all the things we're going to go over. I'm not going to read the whole list, but just a quick summary as to why I'm even doing this or why we thought to do it. There were a couple of recent tickets we dealt with, both of which, at least to my mind, showed me that either the customers didn't quite understand how to crop pages and crop out content, or they knew how to do it, but they were doing it in what I would call a less efficient way than they could have done it. So that's basically like that number 2 item there, how to crop a page and crop out content. And as you see, I'm going to do it with a couple different tools, a couple different techniques. Sometimes people, well, not sometimes, it almost always happens if you go through tools that manipulate pages, it'll throw the bleed box out. How do you get it back? And often it'll toss the trim box out. How do you get that back? And I think the last 2 items are kind of known by people who have worked with Twist for a while. Sometimes the documentation is less than obvious. The behavior is less than obvious. And some of the terms they use, I really think have to be decoded into real English. So what I'm going to do, because I think I have to kind of set the parameters what I'm going to do and what I'm trying to come out with. Otherwise, when I run through these workflows, it'll be kind of nonsensical what I'm doing or why I'm doing it. So one of the hotline tickets we had, there was a very specific request. They wanted to take everything in a page that is more than 1/4 inch from trim, and they wanted that content cropped out. Now, that's not to say that they wanted the page size changed, but they wanted everything beyond 1/4 inch from trim thrown away. Obviously, the trim box has to be intact. And if you do still want the bleed box, you'd like that. And, if the trim marks get cropped out from the outside, you got to have some way to get them back in, right? So I will show you now my ridiculous test page that I'm going to work with that you will be sick of looking at by the end of it. I'm tired of looking at it. But this is what we're playing with. This is the original page. The green is trim, goes to trim. The blue goes to bleed. Bleed is an 1/8 inch. That little purple is an extra 1/8. So from trim to the purple is 1/4 inch, right? So what we need is everything outside of that purple needs to go away. The pink needs to get cropped out. The images need to get cropped out as well. They should get cropped to that 1/4 inch. And in perfect world, really, this is what we should end up with. It should be cropped in from there, 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 and there. The page size should still be the same, so we will just have a white area, have a 1/4 inch of white outside, and our trim and our bleed should stay intact. So that is the goal. And I know many people, they want to create normalized PDFs that are consistent in that in this case, there's always going to be a 1/2 inch outside of trim, and the last 1/4 inch of that is going to be blank. So where, it's an area you may want to throw in some logos and all your crop marks and all that stuff. So let's get started. Now, anyone who knows me knows I think that the MergeXP tool is the greatest tool in the history of civilization. So I'm going to start with the MergeXP. And again, the goal is to crop out that 1/4 inch, blank it out, keep the page, keep the trim. And as we go through this, I'm going to run the same page several times, and it's going to do several different things. Some of them are good, some of them are bad. So let's start out with some badness here. This is going to go through 2 MergeXP tools, and everything I do should get deposited in this folder. So we just started, and let's see what we got, and then I'm going to go over how we got it. And if we look at this page, what did we get? We got the page cropped as we want. You notice the trim box is wrong. And also it still doesn't have the full page size because there should be a 1/4 inch of white out there. So we can deduce that approach doesn't work. What do we have here? We have exactly what was requested. Cropped out the 1/4 inch outside. We got the trim box still set correctly. You can see the green line. And just so you know, you see that I placed the trim marks within the MergeXP. That is the 1 week's extra bonus work that I put into this. So essentially, I put in 1 trim mark per day. So you can see that I went the extra mile. But now let's look and see how did I do that? Because the setting I want to go over here is really the setting that I think is often missed. And one of the reasons it's missed is because of at least the way I look at it, the bizarre way that it's named. First, let's look at the setting that gave us this file. Cropped properly, but trim box wrong. Basically, all we're doing is bringing in a page. And if you look at the setup here, there is absolutely no setting in here except for this bottom setting. And this thing is called window bleed. And, for years I looked at that and it really didn't mean anything. What window bleed really is, it's cropping. You're cropping in on the page. And there are 4 settings that you need to give it. Now, I should have gone over this earlier, but we'll look at it in a second. Any one of these workflows that we're playing around with today, you have to capture page geometry information. If you don't get that, I think most of the people on this call have dealt with this stuff before, but if you need your memory refreshed, margin millimeter underscore left is the distance from the left-hand side of the page, media box to trim on the left. Distance from top to trim, right? So what I'm essentially saying here is I want to move this far in from the left. I want to move into trim minus a 1/4 inch in order to crop the way I want. And in this example that I was showing you earlier, what we're doing is we'll get it back to where it was before I messed around with it. Yeah. So I'm saying come in to trim right there, but minus a quarter. Okay, so that's what crops out everything outside of that quarter inch. From the top, I said come into trim, minus a quarter. Same with the right, come into trim, minus a quarter. And I should have warned you beforehand that there is math involved in this webinar. So everything in here is cropping in from left is a positive. Crop down from the top is a minus. Crop in from the right is a minus. Crop up from the bottom is a plus. So that's how we cropped our page. But as we saw, that thing was messed up. The trim box is wrong. Why is the trim box wrong? It's wrong because the trim margins in ES define an offset from the edge of the page. So when this page came in fact, it's still sitting here in the log. If we look at it in File Check, the offset from the left, which is margin millimeter underscore left, of course, is a 1/2 inch. Fair enough. But we just cropped this page down here. So the page is smaller using that business. So since the page is smaller and we told it to use, this little button means use the margin information from this object, it uses a 1/2 inch in, but a 1/2 inch in, it really isn't where it used to be. So how do we get it to do what we want it to do and how did we get that guy, which has the trim box in place and also has the extra error on the outside? Well, that's pretty easy. In MergeXP, all you do is instead of having one object in there, you have two. Well, actually, I have more because I got all my trim marks in there too. Like I said, that's the week's worth of work. But we're really only interested in these two. This is set up exactly the same way it was in the other. We're cropping in on the page. And I really should have mentioned this before, but when you're cropping in, not only does it crop in, but it also sets the page size at that value. So it doesn't crop in and maintain page size, it crops in and sets page size based on the cropped object. But what we do here is we say, yeah, we know we're going to crop him in, but let's create a box, a window that's the size of the original page. So what we have is, and this gets more into that information that gets dumped from File Check, we're making essentially a blank white page. That's the width and height of the original page. And then we're plopping our cropped page right down in the middle of it. That's how we get that. No, that's how we get that. So you could say, hey, the webinar is over. You did the whole thing in MergeXP, let's go get lunch. But some people don't necessarily like MergeXP. They think it's maybe a little intimidating. And I really think a lot of the pages I've seen or workflows I've seen people work with, they like to work with the Create Pages tool, which in my experience, and I shouldn't admit this, but I've been using Twist for years, but whenever I start working with the Create Pages tool and I have to start goofing around with this thing, the fill and the margins and the force margins and the force page, I have to read the manual again. And we all know that can be a recipe for disaster. Before I move into manipulating things in Create Pages, there was one thing I wanted to review, and I'm not sure what I did with it. Let me find this file. It's not, yeah, this is what I want to show you. As I said earlier, if you want to work with this stuff, you really need to be able to capture all this geometry information from usually the File Check tool. But there's a couple in particular I wanted to point out. Whenever you're working with this stuff and you want to keep the trim box and and your trim margins, you need to find out the height and the width of the trim box. This guy, margin box real height, that's a mouthful, and margin box real width are the width and height of the trim box. However, if you look down below here, you'll see there's another variable called trim box height and trim box width. They are the same thing. If you call that, you will get the same thing as that. Now, why they have both in there, I'm not sure, but for the sake of being a little less verbose and looking at something that actually seems sensible, this is probably the one you should call if you want to call the trim box width and the height. I already mentioned margins, right? This is the distance from the media box to left trim. Distance from media box to bottom trim, right? But if you search through this, you might need to know what the bleed is, because you may want to put the bleed box back in, maybe in the PDF tool when you're all done, right? But if you search through here, you look and you say, where does it tell me what the bleed box is, or what the bleed margins is? Because we know trim is this stuff, margin millimeter left. How far in from the left is trim? How far in from the right? There's no such equivalent for bleed. In fact, traditionally, the way you had to calculate bleed is you would have to compare bleed box left, see that's 9.5, with trim box left. You would have to subtract the one from the other, and then now you know how much there is bleed outside trim. Who wants to do that? Well, maybe some people do, but I don't want to do it. But if you look closely, you see that staring us right in the face is the amount of bleed in this page. And it's right here. Of course, they don't label it as bleed. They have this oddly named variable called trim box top margin. What does that mean? What that means is that bleed is an 1/8 inch away from the top. Trim box right margin, bleed is an 1/8 inch away on the right. So the amount of bleed is listed, but it's not labeled as bleed. It's labeled as trim box bottom margin. So when you go hunting and pecking and you're trying to find it, that's where it is. All right, I probably spent too much time on that. Let's look at the doing this stuff with the Create Pages tool. Again, same thing. I'm going to crop out that 1/4 inch on the outside, throw everything away, keep the page size the same. You can see I'm going through a couple of Create Pages here because, again, I always like to create a bad one and a good one. Here's our 2 resulting pages. What did we get? We got pretty much the same thing we got before when we messed around with the MergeXP, although these are slightly different. Crop to trim, trim box wrong. Not crop to trim, crop to that 1/4 inch. Cropped in the same way, trim box good. All right, neither one was right, but this one's better. How did we get it? This oddly named option here, called fill bleeding, is the exact same option that we saw in the MergeXP tool that's referred to as window bleed. So we basically have 2 options in 2 different tools that are named differently that do the same thing. What they both do is they crop in from the sides and the top of the page to crop out content. And as we saw with the MergeXP tool, not only do they crop it out, but they change the page size based on what we cropped. And we say, well, why did one get the trim box and one didn't get the trim box? Well, it's because in this one, we came in 1/4 inch, but I also said that my trim box should be 1/4 inch in. And again, based on our page geometry, we know that initially trim is 1/2 inch from the edge of the page. Since we cropped in 1/4, it's now only 1/4 inch away. But so what? That still doesn't get us what we want. So how can we manipulate this guy to give us the full page? Well, let's get rid of that guy on the bottom. He's just no fun. If you remember, in the MergeXP tool, we forced a page size on it. We told it to create a page the same size as the original and then slap our crop page on top of it. Some of you are familiar with the force page size option in MergeXP. So what we're going to do is the same thing we did before. We're going to force the original page width on here, and then we're going to try to plop a cropped page in the middle of it. Same boring page. Let's close these things out. I should point out, you may have noticed the other thing I'm doing is both in the MergeXP tool and here in the Create Pages, I'm using the Keep PDF option, so I'm not stuffing through output PDF. What do we get? That looks pretty good. Cropped. The white space is there. The only thing missing is the trim box, so we're almost home. So this is where it gets fun. Because we look in here and say, that's right. We know the margins are 1/2 inch in from the edge of the page. So all we should have to do now is put 1/2 inch in there. Now, this will demonstrate what happens when you start thinking that you know what's happening. So let's run that guy through. Everything's the same, except we now said, yeah, let's set our margins. We're going to go 1/2 inch from the page. And what did we get? We got that monstrosity. The trim box is wrong, and it actually grew the page. And I've struggled with this many times to try to figure out exactly what happened, especially when you try to square it with the way it's explained in the documentation. Because if you look at the help pages for the Create Pages, it specifically talks about working with the margins and this fill bleeding thing if the force page size option is selected, which is what we just did. Again, we did force page size so we could place our crop page inside of the original size page. And it specifically says margin values applied to the created page, the width, and are measured from the borders. Well, to me, that is most definitely not what it did. What it did is it placed the margin on the edge of the created page, and then it grew it 1/2 inch. That just doesn't cut it. And so our hopeful result here is our hopes are dashed, right? But once you come to grips with what that goofy thing is doing, there is a way forward. Let's remember what we did here. We created our force page size, the full size of the incoming page. And then we saw the margin guy stick the margin right on the edge of the page and expand it out. So perhaps we could use that to our advantage. So instead, when we define the page width, we're going to define it based on trim width. We're going to define the height based on trim height. Why are we going to do that? because we know that that guy is going to stick the trim box right on the edge of the defined page, which is trim size, and it's going to expand it a 1/2 inch. And we know we want a 1/2 inch outside of trim. Will that really work? It might. Let's run our page. And again, I need to close that out, so it'll let me open this page up. It's done. And what do we have? We have our page. There's the trim. There's the cropped out, everything outside a 1/4 inch. Everyone's happy until they say, you know, Mike, that's just fine, but I don't have any crop marks on it anymore. And I need to put like my separations and my file name in there. So you're part of the problem. I've known that for years, but you would be correct if you object to that. So now we have to bring the Decorate Pro tool in, which has its own quirks associated with it. Again, one of them being if you don't watch what you're doing, it'll throw the trim box away. So we're going to go through our Create Pages guy. He's going to do all that happy stuff we just told him to do. Now we should get the blanked out everything outside of that 1/4 inch, and we should get all the goodness that the Decorate Pro brings with it. I have to hurry up because I have many more screwed up files to show you. There we go. That should be workflow number 3. What did we get? We got everything we wanted. We chopped the page, we stuck our trim back in, we kept our trim box, and I should note that if you're going to go through the Decorate Pro tool, you can kind of forget about messing with the margins in here, because this guy has his own ideas on what he wants to do. So I use the Create Margins option from within here. And within Decorate Pro, again, if you're using the inside option, it makes perfect sense. It basically goes to the edge of the page and brings the margins in by the predefined amount. Now here's, since we're kind of going over some of the oddities in some of these tools, I want to point out one that, again, can sometimes prove troubling, at least it does to me, in the Decorate Pro tool. You've probably noticed that when you start messing around with this tool, as you turn options on and off, notice how those trim marks show up, go away as I turn things off. Now, when you click on them, the little diagram here would lead you to believe that this guy is bleed, and it would lead you to believe that that guy is trim. And that just isn't true. This guy is the trim mark. And the other thing that you'll notice is you see an offset involved with this. And in many tools in Twist, offset typically means I'm going to shift something left, I'm going to shift it right. So one might be led to believe that this is going to shift the mark away from trim, or move it to the left of trim and move it to the right of trim. So let's see what happens if I actually do that. I think some of you people probably know what that's going to do. Here is the world's most boring page again. Let's clear space in Acrobat so we can open it. Let's see, that's workflow number 3. There's our boy. So did that actually move the trim mark away from trim? No, it didn't. What it has to do with is insetting the trim mark. So since I had it only a 1/8 of an inch, it's still it basically butts right up against bleed. Now, if you want to get it completely outside the work, since the working theory on this Paige model we're working with is to keep everything past a 1/4 inch, that's why I had it offset by a 1/4 to begin with. But the main point I want to make here is that this offset has nothing to do with shifting away, shifting trim left, right, or anything like that. It's the offset of the mark itself from the work. And again, based on what we're up to, we're doing this. This guy defines how far your bleed mark is going to be from trim. And oddly, to get it to come out properly, you have to put a minus value in there to get that to work. Okay. Let's go back to this workflow we were playing with earlier. The one that actually worked, right? This guy. Now, we already know he's fabulous because we run a file through it. So let's run another one through. And this will reveal the failings and the poor assumptions of a lot of the things we've done so far. Mainly because everything I've done so far presumes that I'm getting really nicely prepped files that, you know, had a lot of thought put into them, and they were consistently generated. However, let's look and see what happens. Let's see, that one should have been this one. What happens if somebody gives you a page in which the trim margins are not the same on all 4 sides? Well, what you get is that. And I'm not an expert, but I don't think that's good. And really, this, I'm not sure I've seen many pages like this in the recent past. Let me see if I can find it. Yeah, but sometimes you get these PDFs where they have, you know, a bunch of logos and sign-off areas and slugs in the bottom, and that's just extra slug area. So, for instance, on this page, we can't just slap in that we're going to crop in a 1/4 inch from the bottom, because the trim here is much larger than that. So you really can't get away with this sort of thing in which you just blindly enter in this crop offset with the assumption that everything you get in is always the same. You have to use, I warned you earlier, you have to use math. You have to capture, I think I have one of these here that does this. This one might have it. Let me see if I have this in here properly. Yeah. What you have to do is this. You have to force your values for that crop information, those fill bleedings, so that you come in by the true trim margin on the bottom. In other words, you have to make sure that you actually tug this guy all the way up to the trim, and then again, based on the paradigm we're working in, come up to trim minus a 1/4 inch. So let's take that same file and stuff it through this workflow. This is the number 3 workflow. Well, I'm gonna have to go fast because we want to split some spreads too. Here comes our guy. So with that asymmetrical trim box, we can still get exactly what we want as long as we interrogate the twist variables and tell it to use the exact trim margin that was found in the file, as opposed to just blindly assuming we're always going to be able to get away with cropping in 1/4 inch. Oh, and here's one other thing I should have mentioned. We were talking earlier about bleed. If your page has a bleed box, or even if it doesn't, but you know that you want to keep an 1/8" bleed box, you can search high and low in your twist tools. This guy, MergeXP. You will not find anything that allows you to keep or define a bleed box. The only place you'll find it is in the output PDF tool. And again, I think many of you are familiar with this. You basically say, I want my bleed box to be offset, in this instance, an 1/8" from trim. Just as with almost any other tool and twist, you could always capture some variables and feed those in there if you want to overload it with the set param from RE tool. And instead of talking about it, let's actually do it. Now, the fact is, one of the reasons I've avoided doing it this way so far is that, you know, if you can handle this type of page size and cropping manipulation with, you know, the 3 tools I've been playing with, why incur the extra overhead by going through the output PDF tool again? Let's see, let's close him. As I'm sure some of you know, the reason I have to keep closing these things is because I'm dumping them all into the same folder with the same name, and if it's already open in Acrobat, it's not going to like me. And it's hard to see because of the purple object there, but you can see here now we have the bleed box and the trim. But again, the only way you're going to get that bleed box back is if you throw a output PDF tool in there. I'm going to try to chop spread. How much time do I have left, Fred? I'm going pretty long.
About like 10 minutes we can use up.
All right, 10 minutes. Let's look at what we're starting with. We're starting with that. Now, this is a nicely laid out page. Well, I don't know about nicely, but it's symmetrical. So what do we want to produce from this? We want to produce a left-hand page and a right-hand page. And we do not want to chop just down the middle. We want to chop down the middle, but keep an 1/8" bleed. So the left-hand page should have an 1/8" bleed on the right-hand page should have an 1/8" bleed on the left. And I think over the years, the way I've seen a lot of people do that, well, first I have to find the workflow. Yeah, a lot of people like to do it with create pages. Left one goes here, the right one goes there, they decorate them. And to get left, you have to tag top left, right? Then you have to force a page size on it. You force the document width divided by 2 would get you right to the middle, but I want an extra 1/8" of bleed. So I'm going to add an 1/8" to half of the width of the page. The height you don't have to change. The height is going to be the height because just trying to chop this spread in half. And basically we're feeding the same value. Half the width of the page plus an 1/8 is fed into both of these guys. The main difference is this guy attaches the incoming page to the top left and the forced page size crops it. This one attaches the incoming page to the top right and the forced page size crops him. Does it really work? Let's see. Got to make sure I use the right page. That's our guy. And obviously with something like this, you got to make sure you rename them so you don't create 2 pages with the same name and overwrite each other. So I think you can probably guess that's going to work out just dandy for us. Trim box, can see in the middle, the trim has a little extra because that's the extra 1/8 inch bleed we wanted in the center. And the right-hand page is basically the same. How did we put the trim box back in? Because if you look here, again, I didn't do anything in create pages to chop off that page, right? We got the trim defined for us here in Decorate Pro, but notice it's not the same in all of the left, right, center, so forth. For the left-hand page, we know, see if I got this thing in here. Yeah, right here. The left-hand page, we know that we came in to the center and we goosed it out 1/8 of an inch. So the final page, the trim is only 1/8 inch in from the right-hand side. It's the opposite on the right-hand page. The page was cropped to the center, but we goosed 1/8 inch over. So the left-hand trim is 1/8 inch in for the right-hand side. That sounds confusing. Left-hand trim is 1/8 on the right-hand page. I know this is probably getting very confusing. Let's make something go bad again. That's always fun. Hopefully I have this set up wrong. so it's bad. I think I have this set up wrong. What I'm doing is, once again, feeding in a page that doesn't have consistent trim and bleed around the outside. So if we look at the right-hand page here, well, the bottom's certainly a mess. I know for a fact that's not the center of the page, because the center of the page is kind of in between these two columns of text. And the left-hand page you're going to see is also a god-awful mess. So this is the page that I purposely did silly things with it. Some crazy person, I think that was me, put a big slug of nonsense out here on the left. So the left-hand margin is pretty wide. And also I put an extra slug on the bottom. So again, in dealing with chopping spreads, you really run into the same requirement in that unless you know for a fact that you're always getting these clean, symmetrical pages presented to you, you have to rely instead on the math. And the math is to define the page size that you're working with. I think that's still wrong. Yeah, that's wrong. This one's still not going to come in right because I think I got a good example in the MergeXP. But what you have to do, I have one of these absurd examples for that asymmetrical page. Let me find it. That's not it. Got so many of these open in here. Nope. Well, here's what we have to do. You can't just chop the full page width in half, because if you got all this extra stuff over here, halfway through is, really somewhere around here. It's not going to work. So what you have to do is you have to tell it when you're cropping, crop in the distance from the edge to trim, which I think is there, then come half the width of the trim box, and then keep an 1/8 inch. That all sounds very silly. And again, I thought I had a good example of it in here. This is it. Yeah, this is what we need to do. We need to tell it, come in that far. Then, now that we're right on the edge of trim, go half trim, half the width of the trim box, minus an 1/8 inch. And I showed this to Fred earlier, but and I said I was threatening to show it to you guys, so I will. This is essentially how you do that. Margin millimeter left means, and this is my cropping in from the left. Come here. Then add to that half the width of the trim box, which gets you round about there, I think. But then subtract an 1/8 inch so that you have that extra goodness right there. That's what that is. So let's actually see if I can do that. Now I'm going to do it with MergeXP because I love MergeXP. If I can find it. That's not it. Pretty sure I got it open down here somewhere. There we go. That's my work. And you might look at this and say, how are you going to get a left and a right out of that? Well, I have my ways. So I'm going to send in the asymmetrical goofy Paige. That guy. And we're going to try to get some goodness out of him. Then I'll explain how I did it, assuming it works. See 2 pages coming through. We got a left and we got a right. How do they look? Let's look at the left-hand page. He looks pretty good to me. And let's look at the right-hand page. He is equally fabulous. Trim in place. I put a bonus crop mark in the middle, again, part of the extra week of work that I did. Now, the way I got 2 pages out of this with one MergeXP is I forked the incoming page, so it created 2 processes. In the set param from RE, I told the first fork index to load in a preset param file for the left-hand page. Fork index 2, I loaded in, the preset param file for MergeXP for the right-hand page. Fair enough, that's how I got both of them out. What do those things look like? Let's load the one for the right-hand page. Again, we want to be able to keep that white area outside, so we create a page that is, again, this is probably not the best thing to do in a webinar. I took half the width of the trim box. We might have to send you these workflows for this to make sense. Take half the width of the trim box and add 5/8. Why the hell am I adding 5/8 to it? Well, I have to add 5/8 because I need the 1/2 inch here, right? Because it's trim plus 1/2 there, plus I need the 1/8 there. So that's 5/8. And the height, all I need is trim plus an inch because I need a 1/2 inch top and bottom. Yeah, this is not good. The other thing we can't get away with is we can't say, yeah, just give me the trim margins from the original page, because those trim margins are totally whacked out because we have that big margin on the left and the right. So if you ever played around with this stuff in the MergeXP, you can tell it, I want to set the variables, I want to load in my own values. And since we know what we're doing with this page, we know that top, bottom, and left are a 1/2 inch. No, top, bottom, and right are a 1/2 inch margin. The left is an 1/8 because he's in here, right? So trim is an 1/8 inch in from there again. And how did we crop the page? Because again, I didn't throw in any sort of smaller page like we do in Create Pages. I made the full size page, but I cropped the content out of the page using my window bleed. And I told Fred I'd save this one for last, because if you show that to anybody at the beginning, they're just going to tune out, like you're doing right now. And an important point to make, if I can find it. Yeah, here. You would think that when you're dealing with splitting a spread, you wouldn't have to worry about cropping in from the top and the bottom. You should be able to put zeros. Are you trying to tell me to stop, Fred?
No, go ahead.
Okay.
Finish your thought.
Yeah, I'm almost done. I was going to say, you would think that on the spread, you should say from the top crop in 0, from the bottom crop in 0. We don't care. Well, that's a good point, but again, it presumes that your top and bottom margins are always consistent, and they work within this ½ from trim paradigm that we're working with. But if you want to play it safe and you want to be able to get it to handle every page that it could possibly handle, no matter what crazy stuff gets sent your way, you have to do this. And I'll try to explain what I'm doing here. And this will be the last thing I explain. Let's just use the top as an example. The top offset is this guy. So what did I tell it to do? I told it to crop in from the top by the top margin value. Then I told it to subtract a ½ from it. That's because I want to keep a ½ from trim. But in effect, what happens with this page is if I crop in a ½ goes there, and then I tell it, but minus ½ what does it do? It goes right back where it was. So this is essentially a safety valve, because what it did for the bottom, because I have this goofy bottom margin, right? If I say crop in from the bottom margin, it crops in to there. And then I say, but go out a ½ And what it does is it comes out to here. So that's why you really need to have those crop values in the oddly named window bleed setting. You really need to feed your variables in there, unless your pages are always set the same. You have a very strict regiment of how you want your pages to go out in terms of, how much content is outside trim. You got to do the math. The only good thing I'll say about it is once you've done this, this should work for any page. Any page, I don't care what the margins are. If you want to have just a extra ½ outside trim, this will work for any page. Make it once, use it many times. I hope you're still awake, and I think that's most of what I wanted to cover.
Yeah, we just got a couple quick questions, and I'll keep them short. I think they're short answers. One's asking what your recommendations are for the object merge setting in the MergeXP tool.
Well, my recommendations for that come and go. In general, especially for a page, if a page is the incoming object or a PDF is incoming, typically you should turn that on. My cautionary note on it, though, is I have seen instances in which that has caused the page size to balloon or enlarge. So I would say start with it turned on, but if you do any testing that indicates you're getting page sizes that you're not in love with, you should go back and turn it off and compare. But in general, turn it on.
All right. And the other question would be maybe a webinar unto itself, but is asking about the use of auto trim. And I guess we should just maybe say our thoughts, whether we think auto trim does do a good job or not. Maybe just show it real quick, Mike.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would say about auto trim is it's certainly a tool that, once again, will work well if you're getting pages coming in that are suited to what the tool does. Notably, trim and bleed marks placed in sensible ways that are not. One of the issues you'll sometimes see with it is if you have trim marks that come into the work. If they're not offset far enough, you may see some issues with it.
And I'm not sure if everyone on the call knows what the auto trim tool is meant to do, but basically it'll basically look for crop marks within a page. So especially if you have a lot of ad agencies that'll build an ad on a like 11 by 17 document and just float the ad in the middle and draw in marks and all their kind of like Mike was showing earlier with the slug marks, slugs and sign offs and everything on the bottom. That this tool was created to detect those automatically and set trim and bleed on documents.
And it is a page splitter routine. As you can see, it's got this double page split routine in it. Yeah, it's possible we could probably do a whole webinar on that tool.
Yeah, I think to Mike's point, if the pages are set up correctly and it's good marks, it does a really good job. But obviously it can be tripped up at times since it's actually really rasterizing the document and then looking for what it considers to be trim marks.
Yeah, you've got this option here. Rasterize document ever, rasterize it only if it doesn't find any trims.
Yeah, right. That's an option in case it doesn't find them because it actually will search the document for what should be trim marks by the vector objects themselves and their settings. But if it can't find it, then it'll rasterize it and do that on a raster page.
And the other thing about this tool is, depending on how interactive you may want to get, it does have the ability to stop if it doesn't really find what you're looking for and open up the trim applet so you can get in there and manually set the trims. But again, that's one of those things that depends on your willingness to have a lot of operator interaction with it.
I think we hit the 1 hour mark, so I think we'll go ahead and end the webinar here. If you have more questions, please send them to text@blandsys.com. We'll be happy to answer them. Also, send us an email if you want Mike to package some of these workflows up and send them your way so you can borrow some of his lines instead of having to pause the video and look back through it and try to recreate some of this.
Yeah, I mean, I will say I know that some of this stuff sometimes isn't suited for, because anybody who sees that, even if you have a notion of what it is, it's kind of hard to read it because you can't zoom on these things in the twist editor.
Yeah.
And just remember, use the MergeXP tool for everything. That is. Although I get confused with create pages, I never get confused with that guy. He's a great tool. I'm not sure why I said it's a he. It may be female. I'm not sure.
All right. So appreciate everybody making our webinar today. We'll send out an invite soon for next month's webinar and hope to talk to y'all then. Thanks a lot. Bye.